Hello, and welcome to Breaking Down Barriers to Inclusive Living, the podcast that challenges thinking about disability in the workplace. I'm your host, Bryn Pearlstone, and joining me around the table today are Alan Lewis and Hannah Chalmers. Hello.
Hello.
We are three disabled people with very different health conditions and very different jobs, discussing how our disabilities in the workplace affect us. We're united by our experience by these disabling barriers at work. Alan and Hannah, tell me a bit about yourselves.
Okay, so my current role is within the Scottish Government's Workplace Adjustments team. I've been doing that role now for a couple of years, and really what that's about is anybody coming into Scottish Government or even current staff trying to put in place any equipment, any support that somebody needs to do their job fully and also to feel supported within the organisation.
Hi, I am Hannah Chalmers. I work in marketing and communications for NHS Scotland, and I've been in my role now for 5 years. I think it's self-explanatory, marketing and communications.
And I'm Bryn Pearlstone. I'm a quality impact assessment manager, making sure that all of our policies and procedures and decisions have equality first in mind, working in a public body. I want to start with a quick discussion of disability as it pertains to two different models of how we can view it in society, the medical model and the social model. Alan, can I come to you?
Okay, so medical model and the social model of disability. Medical model really is about the disability being part of that person, something for that person that needs to be fixed. It's very much putting the emphasis on this is something that the person has that's going to get in the way of them functioning within society. Social model is about the barriers within society. So it's about the things within society that prevent people from living to their maximum potential, from living the same kind of lives as their non-disabled peers. And it's about those barriers being taken away, overcome, so that they no longer present the challenges to people. So in terms of the barriers that would feature within the social model, there can be physical barriers, how people access buildings, services, information even. There can be attitudinal barriers, people's perceptions about what disabled people are capable of doing, how the kind of support that should be available to disabled people, the kind of adjustments that should be made, and structural and systemic barriers. So that's really about how things are set up, the kind of policies that are in place, procedures, how organisations work, how institutions work. So those three types of barriers can all present their own challenges, and within the social model it's about the work that needs to be done to make those barriers, to take those barriers out of the equation essentially, so that people can function and live the same kind of lives as their non-disabled peers.
Thanks, Alan. Coming to you now, Hannah. How important is it for disabled people to start talking about and addressing these barriers for inclusion as a society as a whole?
I think it's incredibly important, especially if you have an invisible health condition. People don't know what they don't know, and I think you would be surprised at the willingness of people to help you if you just ask for it. Personally, I think I have experienced sort of issues with asking for help because I've always been quite independent, but it's okay. It's okay to ask for that help, and I think what can be quite difficult sometimes is when you do ask for that help and you don't get it, and that does happen, and you're sort of made to feel like it's just your problem alone to deal with your disability, when it isn't the case. It's society's job to make society more accessible for disabled people. It's not our job to work around society.
Absolutely. Alan?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, if you were to reverse a lot of that, I think one of the things is because disabled people are in a minority and society is set up for a majority, a lot of people, I think, have to feel as though they have to have a lot of resilience and fight really hard for the things that they should be entitled to, the things that they should be able to expect. There's definitely been progress, but I think there's still a long way to go to make society properly accessible, both in and out of work, in terms of what needs to happen to make that feel flawless, I suppose, and kind of quite fluid.
In this podcast series, we're going to be addressing these three main types of barriers: physical, attitudinal, and structural and systemic barriers. And we're going to be discussing them and breaking them down and looking at ways that we can get past these barriers and help bring people on board to make a more inclusive society. This episode, we're going to start with physical barriers. I would like to ask both of you, starting with Alan, What physical barriers do you face in the workplace?
For me, the physical barriers, I'm registered blind, and the physical barriers will be around when I first go into an office. So obviously when I'm going to a new building, I don't have a clue about the layout of that building, how to move around that building. So I need to spend time working with people to learn how that building works. I would need to work with somebody as a sighted guide around that building and be shown where some of the key features, kitchen, toilet, canteen if it is what it is, one, all those kind of things are. So that's the obvious kind of physical barrier with me just functioning within the workplace. There are other, as I've mentioned earlier, there are other things which I would consider to be also physical, which is around how I access information within the office. If things aren't available electronically, happens less and less now, but if things were presented in a hard copy print format, it would be about how I would have to get access to that information so that I could do my job and have access to the full amount of information that I would need in order to do that.
For sure. Just as an example to that, you wowed us all 5 minutes ago with the machine on your table, your Braille note taker. We'd never seen it before. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things, if I'm going to attend a meeting or if I'm going to attend a training event and I need to refer to notes on the day, similar to somebody reading from a print document, the only way I can do that is to have this Braille note taker which has got an electronic memory in it. Because if I, for instance, was trying to listen to notes on audio, I would have an earpiece in which would then distract me from what else was going on within the room. So it's the equivalent of my hard copy, really, to use a Braille note taker to access those notes.
And Hannah, coming to you, what physical barriers do you face in the workplace?
So I used to work in retail. I had a couple of retail jobs when I was at uni. I started working in a jewellery shop. It was just a Christmas temp job, but it became apparent that even though they let me take extra breaks and things to sit down, that my body just couldn't cope with being on my feet physically for 8 hours at a time, and it was causing me a lot of pain. So I had to leave that job, and I think that's probably the job out of all my retail jobs I liked the most. So I was really upset about having to leave it, and I went to work in a call centre instead because, you know, you're not on your feet.
So it's incredible how this barrier really dictated and redirected your career. And it's really powerful how these barriers can manifest to change how we view our careers. I myself have a congenital condition in one of my arms. I faced unemployment for a few years, and I felt so disempowered to work behind a bar, for example, where you've got to do a lot of juggling lots of things, holding and pouring at the same time. If I can't hold a glass and pour a bottle at the same time, I can't work behind a bar. And that kind of a physical barrier to me really disempowered me from my career.
I think it's that thing about when I'm talking as well about accessing a building, being a physical barrier the first time that you go in. That also brings in people's attitudes, because if you're made to feel as though people are having to do extra to help you to access a building, I think that's a very different experience from if you feel as though you're working as part of a team and you're bringing what you bring, somebody's helping you to maybe meeting you at reception, helping you to get to your desk, blah, blah, blah. You're then providing them with support on something else. If it feels like a team approach, that almost makes it feel like less of a barrier, and actually this is just part of the normal workplace and the way it should be, rather than something that's an extra burden for your colleagues to take on.
Absolutely. And these small adaptations to the way that we go about everyday life can really minimize these barriers and sometimes erase them or find workarounds so that we can be included in the conversation and enabled to work how, where, and when we feel like it suits us and works for us. Hannah, what kind of adjustments and adaptations have you found work for you in the workplace?
So in the job I'm in just now, I work in marketing and communications. I have what we call a reasonable adjustment passport. So what that means is if you change managers, you have this passport and that goes with you. Or if you change, maybe you switch teams in the organisation departments. So that's useful because it limits that sort of awkward conversation between you and your new manager, because it is there. You know, it's a talking point. You don't have to say, hey, I'm Hannah, this is what's wrong with me. That's probably the wrong term to use, but that's how it feels sometimes. I also have flexible working, and I now, due to the pandemic, work from home full time. And those are all things that have been really useful to me personally, and to manage my health conditions.
Alan, one word that Hannah just said to me stuck out, which is flexible. How does flexibility of managers and employers really help to get adaptations and adjustments over the line? What's your experience with this?
I think it's crucial. I think, to be honest, flexibility probably underpins most other things, because it always surprises me when large employers in particular don't show a degree of flexibility, because how are you expecting to get the most out of your staff? If you allow people to work in the way that works for them and it kind of safeguards productivity and well-being, you're probably going to get more out of your staff than if you say, no, this is the way that everybody else works, so you need to try and fit in with this way of working. So I think flexibility is almost, for me, a bit of a no-brainer, because A, it benefits the person, but it also benefits the organisation by allowing people to work in the way in which they're most productive and happiest. If you've got happy employees, they're probably going to find that they're going to stay for longer, and they're also going to be more comfortable. They're going to put more into their work. It's just, I think it just squares the circle, really.
For sure. I think it's probably worth considering the opposite, the other scenario where we have employers and managers who are inflexible and who don't necessarily listen to and believe their disabled employees. We have a mutual friend who's a wheelchair user, and he had to fight really hard at work to convince his manager and his employer that actually access to the building, the swipe card pad, was too high for him to reach from his wheelchair. And just to move that down, a simple adjustment to allow him access to the building, to literally remove a barrier of a door, and he had to fight so hard for that because the employer was not flexible.
And it's something so basic. I think that's the thing. It's something that I always think about. If you had 10, 15 employees who had to do exactly the same thing, there would be a walkout, or there would be some sort of protest. But because it affects a small number of employees, any one of these issues, even when it's an issue that affects slightly more people, it's still a relatively small number. So because of that, I think sometimes it doesn't feel like a priority for employers. And actually, it's completely the wrong way of looking at it, because there's that thing about all your employees should be able to expect the same level of support. So I think it's kind of missing the point, really, by viewing it as, well, this is one person's an issue to be resolved for this one person. Because by doing that, the thing that you've spoken about, Bryn, about moving the keypad, that would also make the building then accessible for anybody else in a wheelchair who wanted to use that building.
That's what I was going to come on to next, which is how these adaptations can help people more broadly, right? I was at the gym the other day watching the TV, and there were subtitles, and I thought, well, this is a weird situation. Subtitles were invented and were created and popularized to help deaf people and hard of hearing people to participate. But here I am at the gym watching the TV. I can't hear it, but I can read the subtitles, and I'm quite happy. Hannah, what examples do you think of adaptations that are in place can benefit people more broadly?
I think when we're talking about our mutual friend who is a wheelchair user, sort of the aspect of driving, that always pops into my head, because I don't drive. So that is something that is a real struggle, both for just everyday life, but also for job opportunities. You do limit yourself if you don't drive in society. And I think our mutual friend that is a wheelchair user, they have an adaptable vehicle, but the costs for that are just astronomical. Accessible vehicles are really, really expensive. It's not just the car itself, it is all the adaptations that need to be made to it, and often the funding isn't there or is only partially there, and people have to really fight to get the funding that they need, which our friend did. And I think society relies far too much on people being able to drive. You see it in the slow erosion of our public transport services in terms of availability, but also in terms of cost as well. It's just more expensive to be a disabled person in general, but I think particularly if you don't drive, because you're having to get taxis, you're having to get buses, you're having to get trains, or you're having to perhaps ask family members or friends for lifts, and it makes you feel less independent. It makes you feel like you are, I don't like using this word, but it does make you feel sometimes like you're a bit of a burden, because you're asking people constantly to take you places. And yeah, I think that's one of the big things is just transport, driving, and accessibility to places that are not on your doorstep and walkable.
Alan, did you want to come in?
I do think that restrictions that folks who drive wouldn't necessarily have to consider within day-to-day life. And for work as well, actually, because if you're supposed to be at a meeting at a particular time, the amount of planning and preparation that goes into that versus somebody who can drive, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of how you're going to get there. If you need to meet somebody when you get there, so that you can be guided through reception, all of that. So I think access to transport is one of the biggies when it comes to how people physically access an environment, and kind of work and personal environments as well.
Let's revisit this in the episode down the line about structural and systemic barriers, because I think that's a key example here. And I think mitigating these barriers for all people can be really transformative. In Scotland, roughly 1 in 5 people, 20% of people, have an impairment or a health condition and are functionally disabled because of their interactions with different kinds of barriers. And half of them are in work, so 10% of the workforce is being disabled by some of these barriers that we've been talking about. And imagine the potential of these 10% of all the people in Scotland. We don't know who they could be or what they have to offer. And once we start to break down these barriers, the things that they can offer to society is huge. It really has so much potential. So, to both of you, what advice do you have for challenging some of these physical barriers in the workplace? Starting with Alan.
Be led by people's experience. So, regardless of how things have been done previously, of how things have been currently done within a workplace, if you have somebody coming in to your team, to your work environment who has a disability or health condition, have that conversation, find out what works for them, find out if they don't know, that's absolutely fine, but have an open mind, think through, okay, this is what we could look at, this is what we could put in place. So I think just be prepared to think outside the box and actually be flexible, as we've already said, in your approach as to what might work, even if that does mean that you have to change around the way things are currently being done. It's the idea of equality isn't about treating everybody the same, it's about treating everybody in a way that allows them to give their best, to function at their greatest potential within the workplace.
And Hannah, what advice do you have for breaking down some of these physical barriers in the workplace?
It's important to be as open and transparent with people as you feel comfortable being, because people will have misconceptions if they've not met you in person and things like that. And I think that's one thing, like, be open and, again, have these important conversations, like show people that there's a lot more to disabled people than society thinks. Like you've said, the opportunities employing disabled people can bring to an organisation, I just don't think that people really truly know. And the resilience that we have as a group of people, I think, is just incredible. Yeah, that's my advice. Just try and be brave about it as well.
I think that's a really hopeful place to be ending this edition, focusing on what we can achieve and who we need to be, and emboldened in our disability, in our activism. So thank you again, Hannah and Alan, for joining me here today. I've been Bryn Polstone, and you've been listening to Breaking Down Barriers to Inclusive Living. Catch you next time.